to please chair the session today. Please take your seat, ma'am. We welcome you. And the respective speakers for today's session are Adra Mansi. Please come and take your seat. K. Srilata. We welcome you also, ma'am. Megha Singh. Medha Singh, please take your seat. Rumi Nakwi. We welcome you, sir. Now I would invite Mr. Raj Mohan to please welcome our guests on the stage by stole presentation. उत्तरीय देकर स्वागत करेंगे. Thank you, sir. So as the session starts, it is on Kavita Atma Ki Abhivyakti. The topic for this is poetry, the expression of soul. कविता मनुष्य की प्रारंभिक अभिव्यक्तियों में से एक है. कविता कोई सीमा नहीं जानती, चाहे वह प्राकृतिक हो अथवा मानव निर्मित. कविता हृदय की अभिव्यक्ति है, आत्मा का प्रवाह है, आसपास की दुनिया से जुड़ी क्रिया है तथा लक्ष्य से परे पहुंचने की आकांक्षा है. कविता से हर एक व्यक्ति अपने को संबंध कर लेता है, चाहे उसकी सामाजिक स्थिति कैसी भी क्यों ना हो. इसीलिए यह स्वाभाविक है कि दुनिया के सारे कवि एक ही कालखंड अथवा क्षेत्र में ना जन्मे होने के बावजूद सहोदर हैं. मानवता की एकता की अवधारणा से ही वसुदैव कुटुंबकम का भाव उभरा है तथा इस प्रकार की काव्य दृष्टि किसी भी तरह के प्रतिबंध और सीमा को नहीं पहचानती. सच्चे अर्थों में कविता सार्वभौमिक है तथा इस सत्र में प्रख्यात कवि इस विषय पर चर्चा करेंगे. Poetry is one of the earliest expressions of human beings. Poetry does not know any barriers, natural or man-made. Poetry is the expression of the heart, outpouring of the soul, an act of relating to the world around, an aspiration to reach beyond the given. As such, poetry is relatable by one and all, irrespective of one's status in this world. So, it is natural that poets in the world are siblings, though they may not be born in the same era or region. Out of the perception of oneness of humanities arose the dictum Vasudeva Kutumbakam. And such a poetic vision doesn't recognize any barriers or borders. Poetry is truly universal, and in this session, eminent poets will discuss about the topic. So with the kind permission of the chair, I would like to introduce the speakers today. Yes, ma'am? Yeah. So first of all, I would like to introduce Sukrita Paul Kumar. Sukrita Paul Kumar is an eminent English poet, critic, editor, translator, and painter. She was fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, and an honorary fellow of the International Writing Program of University of Iowa, USA, and an honorary faculty of the Durrell Center in Corfu, Greece. Currently, she is guest editor of Sahitya Academy's bi-monthly Indian literature. The next eminent speaker is Adra Mansi. She is a poet based in New York City. Her poems have been featured in journals and anthologies in the US, UK. In 2020, her poems were part of an international online exhibition, Ignite, from within the confines, that brought together artists and poets to reflect on the COVID-19 pandemic. In January 2023, her bilingual poem, Death in Stanzas, in Malayalam and English, was featured at the Jaipur Literature Festival as part of Sahit Academy's Writers' Shorts. The next speaker is K. Srilata. She was formerly Professor of Literature at IIT Madras. Her books include 5 collections of poems, the latest of which, The Unmistakable Presence of Absent Humans, was published by Poetrywala, Mumbai. Srilata is the editor of the anthologies The Rapids of a Great River, The Penguin Book of Tamil Poetry, Short Fiction from South India, All the Worlds Between, a collaborative poetry project between India and Ireland, and Lifescapes, interviews with contemporary women writers from Tamil Nadu. Next speaker is Medha Singh. Medha Singh is a poet, translator, and editor. She took her MSc in creative writing from the University of Edinburgh. She is editor of Burforis, London. She has published a translation of love letters from French penned by Indian modernist painter Syed Haider Raza. I Will Bring My Time, love letters by S.H. Raza. Her poems have appeared in several international literary journals and have also been part of many national and international anthologies. Her work has been translated into Hindi, Spanish, and French. Medha was longlisted for the Toto Fund's The Arts Awards in 2019 and 2020. And another eminent speaker today is Rumi Naqvi. He is a poet and a translator. He teaches English at Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, since 1995. He is a recipient of
a poet. And so in this context, particularly in the context of the title of this session, I think this word soul becomes important, right? So I'm saying it very soulfully and not mournfully. And I am missing him tremendously because he was very excited about coming here. And he is, as we all know, nearly 96 years and more, going on to 97, and extremely enthusiastic and publishing very, very anxiously, as if, which we all feel as poets to some extent, but with age, one gets to be even more frantic about, oh, there's very little time, hurry up and do this and do that, right? So you won't believe it, almost once a 10 days, at Indian Literature, the journal, I'm getting a contribution by him. Not by way of writing poetry, that of course is seminal, but also translating other Oriya poets into English and sending them left, right, and center. And I don't know how to say no, because my mandate is not to publish the same person too many times. There has to be a gap between one publication and another at IL. But I want to publish just to keep him going excitedly into the domain of poetry more and more. Blessed is he, and we seek his blessings, and we want to really continue. And I'm, as I said, a very poor substitute. I was trying to get an appointment with my soul yesterday night, and it refused to come up, you know. And I don't know what to say, because I'm going to leave it to my colleagues here, who will soulfully speak about their expression of the soul. But yes, I am very intrigued about the subject. Initially, I was kind of laughing at the subject. What does the subject mean? But if you begin to think of it seriously, it's too serious to handle. It's actually too serious. How do you find that soul within yourself? I think one of the ways to do it is to write poetry. But write poetry not only with the consciousness of crafting poetry, but also, I mean, craft is important, but also to find out what exactly, and not even find out, maybe just understand some shade of truth, some element of truth about what we are doing, why we are existing, what is the purpose of existence, why this universe, and do all that through very specific reality. That's the challenge, of the here and now. How do you, within this here and now, reconcile the body with the soul, right? There are many things that our body tends to do unsoulfully, with no conviction. So how do you connect the two? And what is this dichotomy, this artificially created dichotomy between body and soul? Because ultimately, I think one needs to be integrated. And to some extent, what brings to my mind is T.S. Eliot's association of sensibility. Emotion and intellect and everything coming together. I don't say that soul is only emotion or only intellect, or I think it's all coming together. And he uses very clever terminology and words to say all this. Emotional apprehension of intellect and intellectual apprehension of emotion. Have I got it right? There's so many academics, right? So without going into the jargon, but the point is that yes, when you are in the moment of writing poetry, that experience of the moment becoming eternity, time flowing into, all dichotomies dropping as dichotomies and something kind of unifying as sensibility, which you are unconscious about, and only when you read your poem after writing it, you realize that something like that has happened. And then you come back to that other chat GPT level. I don't know if there's a level to it. Maybe that is higher or lower. I don't know. There's no hierarchy. But it's a machine that one is talking about, right? So it's only after you come out of it that you begin to wonder. I don't know, many of you sitting here, very seasoned poets, but I personally feel that there is a sense of wonder about how did this happen? The poem has to happen. And you wonder about it. You come to it as a stranger, as a reader, after finishing with it. And so I think those are the moments, if one tends to stay with those moments, we will reach the final poem of silence. Because ultimately we are using words to create silence. Not a silence which is full of noise, but silence which cannot be reduced to meaning. That's what as teachers we were told to do. Yeah? Therefore it means this. There is no therefore and no reasoning. The tyranny of logic has to go. Yeah? There is a tyranny of some kind of logic. And I think one of the things that we do is to defy logic. And maybe there's another logic to that, right? It's a trap, it's a trapping. Because there has to be also a sequencing of thought, even if it is to defy logic. A logic has to be created. So we are entrapped in a variety of ways. But yes, there are moments of glimpses of truth which are also contradicting themselves from one phase of writing poetry to another at times. There are contradictions and there are paradoxes, and we don't need to reconcile them because that is what is life, So I can go on with the bhashan, but as a teacher, I'm used to 50 minutes of a lecture, at least. But I don't want to be a teacher here. And I do want to see, I'm very curious to see what, on this side of the dais, how many people are going to say what? I do not know. But you have the freedom to not only say through whatever you want to through prose, but you can read your own 2-3 poems, maybe short ones, and also read somebody else's poem, if you like, to see where there are glimpses of what we call the soul, if at all we are able to define what this is. And we don't need to define it. I think people will quietly understand that this is, when we use words like, oh, I am touched, I am moved, what exactly is that? Getting touched and moved, and it is that triggers, something gets triggered in. We will start as per the order that is given here. The order, I mean sequence. Ardhara Mansi, we can start with you. And this is truly an international forum because you are here from New York. There you are. So please come and talk. If you want to talk from here.
Thank you, Sukrita. Can you hear me? Good. Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here at UNMESHA and to be part of this very distinguished panel. And I also see some very familiar faces. Thank you, Sahitya Academy, for having me here. I've been reflecting on the theme of today's session. And I remembered that I was taking the train to work a week ago, and it was one of those very rushed mornings in New York City. It was a New York subway. And the transit system there has this very interesting project called Poetry in Motion. And it's an effort to actually display poems on trains and subways, accompanied by beautiful works of art. So on the train that I was on, there was this poem by, 11-line poem by Maya Angelou. And it was, incidentally, it was titled Awaking in New York. And I was just looking at my co-passengers, the fellow passengers, and most of them were, of course, glued to their phones. And I could see the anxiety, the anticipation for the upcoming day, which was writ large on their faces. But I also noticed that most of them actually took a moment to actually look at the poem which was displayed there, and they read the poem. So poetry, for me, is an invitation to slow down. And I think poetry talks to our deepest sense of the self. The past few years have not been easy on any of us with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are still kind of reeling under the impact of the pandemic in different ways. I spent my lockdown days in New York, basically staring outside my window. And there was this Callery pear tree outside my window. And I was just watching the seasons change. And unfortunately, they cut down that tree at the moment. We don't have that tree anymore there. And I mostly took refuge during the pandemic days in reading world poetry, thanks to translators who actually brought alive some of these works, be it Chinese, European, Japanese, and so on. And I started a personal project on Twitter with the hashtag quarantine verses. And it was an effort to basically share with the world what I was reading at that moment. And I ended up, by some miracle, posting 100 poems each a day. And it was called Quarantine Verses, the project, I named it. And what I actually learned from this process of posting the poems was, when things fall apart, we either look for answers within ourselves or we look to the world outside. I do have a friend who tells me when she's in distress, she goes and reads this poem by Mary Oliver. It's called The Wild Geese. We have Abhay here, who is also, he likes that poem a lot. And Wild Geese, it ends with this beautiful line which talks about our place in the family of things. And I have another friend who actually shares, who shows me her garden through a WhatsApp call. And she talks about the subtle symmetry of a beautiful sunflower in her garden, or the ripening strawberries in her garden. And we exchange this the lines from a William Blake poem, which says, to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower. And I'm sure many of you in this room, you have experienced this when you're actually looking for the right words to talk about a specific emotion, and suddenly you see this poem which captures that inexplicable sentiment in you. And I'm sure you all have a poem, a favorite poem that you actually return to. It might be something you read as a child in a school textbook, or maybe later in your life. I'm talking about like poems which have traveled with you over the years, and poems that you often return to. And each time you read it, you feel that it's different. And if you ask me, the poems that actually speak to me have a soul of their own. And I think they speak to matters of the heart. In what John Milton, he talks about poetry which is simple, sensuous, and passionate. And the poets and poems that over the years that I have been intuitively drawn to kind of share this feature, be it the Polish poet Wisława Szymborska, or the Swedish poet Tomasz Tranströmer, or the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai, or the American poet Louis Gluck, or even closer to home, poems by A.K. Ramanujan and Kamala Das. And recently, I've also been drawn to reading more of Japanese haikus. And I really like the way they distill the present moment. Sukrita, you were talking about here and now. And how they capture the impermanence of our lives. And also the inherent kind of contradictions. It's always not black and white, right? We operate in somewhat that gray zone that's in between space, which many of these poems capture. And these haikus actually talk about wonder, beauty, a sense of knowing and also not knowing, which is sometimes beautiful. Let me read out a few haikus for you here. This one is by one of my favorite haiku poets. She's a female poet, Ono no Komachi, and she's from the Japanese Heian period. And she writes, "The colors of the flower fade as the long rains fall. As lost in thought, I grow older." And this is a translation by Kenneth Rexroth. This is by Ono no Komachi, and I'll read another by Kobayashi Issa. And this reads, "Under a cherry tree, there are no strangers. Under a cherry tree, there are no strangers." I'm struck by how these poets kind of capture the essence of our vanishing lives, the transient vanishing lives. Also, you can see that the natural world here, be it the flower in the rain or the cherry trees, they are used to actually evoke an inner state of our being. Jane Hirshfield, poet Jane Hirshfield, who has extensively studied these haikus, talk about, she kind of observes that when we read a haiku, there is a transformation. There is an alteration of being which takes place. And I think it can also be applied to poetry at large and not just haikus. So when we read a poem, what is like changing within us? Maybe it is something as simple as, your mind travels from one thought to the other. Or maybe you're suddenly stirred by a fragment of some memory that, exists somewhere in your head. Or maybe there is a shift in awareness from an external phenomenon to your inner being. So there are different ways like poems are experienced. And I think, Sukrita, you also raised it. How do you actually experience a poem? I think that's a question I've been interested in too. And neuroscience, philosophy. Neuroscientists and philosophers, they talk about different conceptualizations of the self. What constitutes the self? Is it the body? Is it the mind? How do you transcend these dichotomies sometimes? And in my understanding, when you actually read a poem, be it, a written word or a spoken word, you actually experience it with your whole being. So you experience the poem in both your body and the mind, and what neuroscientists call the embodied self. And I think it's with this embodied self that we should read poetry. That's what I feel. And poems must be felt. They can't be analyzed. Again, you use the word rationality. I think we should banish that word from the scene. Poetry for me, over the years, has opened new ways of seeing the world, new ways of understanding the world. This Irish poet, the renowned Irish poet Seamus Heaney, he has this interesting quote. I'm just paraphrasing it here. He says that poetry, I don't know about poetry changing the world, but poetry does change our understanding of the world. And I think that's very crucial when we talk about a world strife with, wars, violence, sectarianism, you name it. And yesterday we heard Her Excellency, the President of India, talk about how literature can transcend barriers. And I think this is where poetry really offers the scope for, collective understanding, collective learning. Because poetry, at the heart of it, it asks these fundamental questions. What is it to be human? What is it that connects you and me? What is it, what is that feeling to be part of the whole? And these are fundamental questions that are worth reflecting on. And I think poetry really offers that very intimate, that shared space where we can talk about, reflect on these questions, but at the same time also talk about some of these universal emotions, be it love, hate, greed, grief, and so on. And we are also here under the aegis of India's G20 presidency, which talks about Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam. That's the theme of this year's session. And I think poetry can actually be a vehicle, as I said, for collective understanding. On this note, I'm just wrapping up my remarks, and I would like to maybe share a few lines that I wrote with you all. So let me read 2 poems. This first poem, I think I was earlier talking about Japanese aesthetics, and how I'm actually really drawn to haikus these days. And this poem is actually a scene from an everyday life, where I just watched my husband go to this French pastry shop to buy a croissant. And that was the inspiration for this poem. So this poem is titled Croissant. Like a Chinese monk lost to his thoughts, he goes to buy a croissant with a book of verses to read along. As he returns, a leaf turns yellow and falls. The half-eaten croissant slips, and raisins break free to scatter like prayer beads. Autumn has arrived finally. The second poem is about loss and death. And again, I think that's an experience that all of us had at some point in our lives. And I've named this poem, Death in Stanzas. Death in Stanzas. A friend who is an obituarist told me how she prepares a draft when a writer, actor, or a politician is ailing. She strives for 5 paragraphs and 800 words. Death has a word limit. My cousin draws his face close to the earth where my grandmother is cremated. He strains his ears to listen and asks her, "Do you see the rain? Can you feel the grass?" Death is less abstract now. Our koi fish died of fin rot yesterday. We carried her body to the East River, lit an oil lamp, and let her swim again. I remember the pale yellow of her scales. Death has a color of its own. Albert Camus died in a car crash despite a train ticket in his pocket. As a child, I fervently prayed that no one may die at home. But for the fear of being punished for this selfishness, I changed the wordings and prayed that the world be saved. Death is a stern prophet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ardhara. I think a couple of things that you said are some things to take behind or take along, you know. One of the things, one of the lines that are very emphatically coming to me is death is less abstract right now. I really find it very interesting as a concept because one would either think of it as completely as an abstraction, and the other thing is that, oh, death has a color, right? And interestingly, I was trying to look for my poem which says death is transparent like truth, you know? So, I mean, we are all wondering about what this business of death is, because we don't know, we haven't died yet. But maybe we have died a billion deaths, don't know, because there are different kinds of deaths that happen within oneself, right? So, anyway, one of the things, before I hand over the mic to you, would you like to go there or here? All right. Is the fact that I was just reading Wittgenstein yesterday in some context, and I came across this line which I would like to share with you. And he says, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Now, this is something so strange because our game as poets, our concern and engagement totally is with words. And every time we are using words or translating our thoughts and emotions into words, each time those words are actually also constructing a world for us, right? And so ultimately, if one were to really understand that world of Ardhara or Srilata or one of the poets, it would be the construction of so many different worlds, as it were. So this limits the way that we construct for ourselves, and therefore a whole journey of how do we deconstruct them, which is what also I think you referred to somewhere. So this whole process of deconstruction or decoding and then encoding, I mean, this is a perpetual journey. Let's continue with it, Srilata. Your turn now.
Thank God I made it through without falling off the dais. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Thank you, Sukrita and Ardhara also. I just want to begin by, responding both to Sukrita and to Ardhara, their remarks, So on my way to Bhopal on the flight, I was reading this poet Tom Wayman. He's a Canadian poet, and he writes in a genre that's loosely titled work poetry. I had read Tom Wayman before, one or two of his poems, but not this particular collection. I think it's called The Order in Which We Do Things. And what Wayman argues in his preface or in his introduction is that we really need to sort of what is this thing that we call soul? I mean, soul is something that's kind of embodied in the body, in the working body, right? And he actually, all his poems are about the working day. How do working people do time, right? And he, for instance, has this lovely poem where he talks about when he does a day shift. So he's actually held several different odd jobs, right? Before he went on to becoming a teacher and getting into the white collar kind of segment. So he talks about blue-collar work, and he talks about the factory floor, where he measures his time by, the number of pieces of work he has to finish, or what he has to hammer down, and how many more minutes left for a tea break, how many more minutes left for an afternoon lunch break. And that afternoon lunch break, if it's 20 minutes, does he get 3 minutes to stretch his limbs or does he not? Does it mean that he can't finish eating his sandwich? So the poem is about that. And that's just one of the poems he's written, and I found it fascinating. And when I was listening to both Ardhara and to Sukrita, this kind of ran through my mind, and I said, I think that's also a very, very important task of poetry. And when you use the word soul to say, this is something that I think there's a way in which poetry has to respond to the concrete, to what is around you, and in as truthful a way and as honest a way as possible. And, there's a way in which you can, I think, write about the most difficult, the most political of things, really, right? But in a way in which, you might actually get it past the censors, right? And I think for me, that the fact that poetry exists really outside, to a large extent, it exists outside of the money economy. Even in publishing, we had a very interesting session this morning earlier on publishing, agenting, and ChatGPT and all of that, right? And what sorts of books sell, and what makes what kind of, I mean, how many copies of what kinds of books are sold, and all of that we heard, right? And I was thinking about this, and most of my books, I must tell you, have not sold very well. There's one, I think, non-fiction title which was published by Westland. It's called This Kind of Child, The Disability Story, which I think has sold a reasonable number of copies. But otherwise, my poetry, so let me be very clear. I think if I maybe manage to sell 500, that's like a bestseller for me in the world of poetry, right? So in a sense, I think poets and poetry, poets are used to this fact of actually just writing, regardless of whether there's 2 people that you're reading to, or like 5 people who are buying your book, or none at all that are buying your book. I was just talking to somebody outside, and they said sometimes my audience is consisted of 2 people, one of whom is a member of the family, and I know exactly because that has happened to me, right? And I've been writing for a number of years, right? So I think by now I should, but that's it. So, but there is readership. That's the good news. There is readership, there's not sales. It doesn't necessarily reflect in sales, but I think I would, it would be nice to have more books sell, but if it doesn't, I think somewhere poets learn to make peace with the fact that, you're sort of compelled. There's an inner demon, right? I don't know if that is to express your soul or what it is that you want to express, but there is something you want to write about, right? And I was asking myself, what is it? Why am I doing this? Why have I been doing this mad thing called being a poet or writing poetry, when I know I can actually write non-fiction? I can perhaps also, I've also got a novel out and it's done reasonably well, but why am I not doing more of that? Why am I sort of doing so much more of poetry, which actually, I still need a day job, I still need to pay the bills. Poetry doesn't pay any of that, right? And the reason is, I think, that in poetry, through poems, you can get at the emotional truth of difficult moments, right, that you want to talk about. And often, in my own case of late, given, I think, the difficult times that we are living through, the turbulent times, right, I think if you don't want to be sort of like thrown into jail or whatever, like the only way you can do it is to write it up as a poem and hope that people are not going to read it, at least the wrong people are not going to read it. I don't know what I hope for, but anyway, so I think I'm just going to sort of say that. So I think the fact that it sort of exists in a slightly shadowy way outside of, the money thing and big publishing and all of that, and the fact that it can bear quiet witness and get to the root of what is it that's troubling us about these times or any of the times that we have been living through. What is it that is troublesome to us, when it comes to our working lives, our school systems, all of those things that exercise us, our political systems, right? What is it that we find so painful about it, right? And that involves soul. I mean, that's soulful poetry, I think, for me, right? So how do I tell those stories without giving the game away? But I managed to tell them, and I managed to sort of stay alive and not be thrown into jail, So these are, I think, important. But of course, there are also poets writing in regional languages. Let's not forget there's Varavara Rao, there's Gaddar, who's an oral poet, a folklore, more a performer, I guess. But I mean, they've been sort of in and out. We know that story. But yeah, so so let me just kind of talk about that, and maybe I'll just take this a minute or two to read some of what I consider like my political poems. And a lot of my poems of late, I think I began by really as a younger person. I wrote because I was an only child. I was lonely. I had a slightly difficult family situation with my parents being divorced and sort of growing up not knowing who I was, all of that, like, a lot of turbulence that many of us face as children. And I was also quite shy, very sensitive, all of that. So I was that kind of a poet. I would write about the trees, the leaves, and, that kind of a really obviously soulful poetry, but which nobody read. I don't think anybody cared, but I was happy writing them. But I think as I've grown up and grown older and really discovered the hard way, how hard life is, also as a mother of a child who has a learning disability, which I've written about in my nonfiction book, This Kind of Child, which is the only book that sold of all my books, I think, right? I find that it's actually a very, very hard world, and I should perhaps, yeah, I should write about the leaves and the trees and the bees and how beautiful the world is, but I should also write about the things that really matter to me, that cut into me, that hurt me in some ways, and not just me, but so many of us, right? And just like Tom Wayman writes about the working classes, and what does it mean to wield a hammer every day? What does it mean to drive a nail, and that's the only thing you're doing? What does it mean to work a crane, you know, and have it fall on your head perhaps, or lose a limb or whatever, right? And that's poetry also for me, right? So I'll just kind of read you a few poems like that. So let me begin with this. Yeah, so this is called, yeah, sorry, I should bookmark this. Yeah, so this is called Everything Drowns Except This Poem. And I think it's self-explanatory, so I'm not going to give you a footnote or a background to this. I'm standing in a country I know like my skin. The rain is falling slim and sweet on crisp butterfly wings, on the singing minds of people. And since there are windows left carelessly open, the rain is falling in a gentle slant on books, on the words inside them. I'm standing in a country of many-hued umbrellas. In it, not one word, not one poem is allowed to drown. I'm standing in a country I once knew like my skin. The rain is falling like knives, snapping the wings of butterflies and the singing minds of people. The rain is falling like hard slaps on books until no words remain, except the ones, wet and angry, which have sought shelter inside this poem. I'm standing in a country of broken umbrellas, where everything drowns, except this poem, wet and angry, that insists on living. Yeah, so the next poem I'll read to you is kind of in the same spirit, and it was written, you know, there was no slow processing time. I think it was a quick response to the moment, and I just sent it out, and I think the Scroll published it, or the Wire, I'm forgetting now, but it was sort of a response to, so actually a very good friend of mine, K. Satyanarayana, who, you know, whose house was raided by the police because it was part of a nationwide swoop. This was back in 2018. And Satyanarayana teaches at EFLU. Some of you may have heard of him. This is actually one of many simultaneous raids on activists across the country for their alleged involvement in the Bhima Koregaon thing. So this poem, and I remember having had a conversation with Satyanarayana. I don't remember quite how, but about this. And well, this poem was really a response to that. So it was, as I said, one of those fairly unprocessed poems. I don't do that normally, but this was just written like that, and I did send it out also. So it's called They Help Themselves to Many Things, for K. Satyanarayana. For 8 hours, they search his house, help themselves to the bread that sits crumbling on the table. They help themselves to the love letters he had written his wife at age 22, run their fingers on their yellow age. They help themselves to a book by Marx he had bought on the footpath of Abbott's for 10 rupees, the dust on its spine thick as the country's decline. They help themselves to a photograph of Ambedkar and then laugh at the spider that scurries from behind it. One of them mock aims a gun at it. They help themselves to his worries about his wife and what they're doing to her in the next room. They help themselves to the father fear in the pit of his stomach, what will become of his daughter if. They help themselves to the revolutionary songs in his head. They even sing them out loud. Their voice is hard and mocking. The words dart like arrows into the dark night that crouches by the window, silent and afraid. Thank you. Okay, so this is perhaps, this is also, again, really a response poem to, I mean, all poems are responses, so it's kind of not a great way of putting it. But this is really in response to the story I read about this grave digger and caretaker of unmarked graves called Atta Muhammad. So he worked in northern Kashmir, where there's always death on an everyday basis. We know that, right? And so the work he did, what Muhammad did, was just simple. It was just a humankind act, I think, in the old-fashioned sense of the term, which is that he would bury these sort of big graves for bodies that were not recognized, that nobody could recognize or even would be able to claim or whatever, and he would take care of their graves, right? He would sort of do that, and until his own passing away. So this is a poem in his memory, really. So this is called, I Bury Them Under the Witnessing Yellow of the Chinar. I bury them under the witnessing yellow of the chinar, blood moon faces yet to taste the sweetness of youth, beards just beginning to show, fake encounters, scarred bodies of great importance to someone somewhere, sons whose mothers will never find them, infants, young girls with torn vaginas, dreams in their eyes. I bury them all, and the blood in my veins grows still. I have spent my hours naming the disappeared, the dead, the forever gone, uttering prayers over each new grave. I have spent them weeping, and the chinar trees have wept with me. Under the same chinar, my old happy self lies buried. A friend teases, Muhammad, you've gotten rather good at this burying business, haven't you? He is right. I'll bury anything that makes its way to me. What I cannot bury is a remembering. So I also, it's not that I, sort of write only poems about the political world. Outside, there's also within the family, within our lived communities, and so on, everyday workspaces, and largely families, which, there's a lot of things that happen, which we think of as maybe personal tragedies, but when you actually think about it a little more closely, you understand that what you think of as personal, as the feminists would say, as feminist criticism would say, is also quite political, right? So, for instance, how is it, or why is it? This is a question that is all I think I'm sort of centrally concerned about. I was just talking to somebody about it earlier this morning. You take women writers, or you take women who have done any kind of work, right? There is a way in which, especially depending on what kind of background you come from, otherwise socially, caste-wise, and so on, you sort of shrink and you occupy a small space. You think of yourself as not so important, right? And sometimes this has to do with physical space, how we hold ourselves, our bodies in space, and we're always sort of conscious about how we come through and all of that. There is a shrinking. There's always an inward shrinking. I know, for instance, I've lived with it for many years. I continue to worry about it. And I don't ask me why. I'm 55. I should have gotten past it, but I have not, right? I also, I think, like many others, women and also men, tend to think of ways to hide and be invisible rather than be visible. Visibility is always a little bit frightening, right? And so this is something that I wondered. And anyway, so this poem kind of really comes up. It's sort of a family biography or an autobiography poem, and it's called Three Women in a Single Room House. So I'll just read it out and let's see. So 1. Not too small, not too big. This apartment with its balcony on which our son can ride his tricycle, its kitchen with no walls, so we can cook and still belong to the rest of the house, is what I've sold my diamonds for, thinking over the agent's glibness of my grandmother who had bequeathed them to me. They had once shone talisman-like in the dark of that small room where we three lay, she, my mother, and I, on the floor in a row, 3 women used to small spaces. 2. My mother is sitting on the only bed in the only room in the house, writing something. When she's done, I find an ink stain on the sheets. One of them is an outstretched wing. 3. My grandmother is working her sewing machine in a corner of the only room in the house. She's making me a dress 2 sizes too large, so you can grow into it, she says. And when it is done, go on, try it. 4. It was never more than 7 steps from anywhere to the only window in the single-room house, and I would like to tell you that the sky floated in through the slats, filled us, my grandmother, my mother, and I, with spaciousness. I would like to tell you that we learned to take up space. The truth is, we just grew used to small spaces, the three of us, rough diamonds stuck in mines that ran too deep to catch the light. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Wonderful, Srilata. This was a pleasure listening to you. And I think a lot of what we were saying also gets demonstrated, but another big dimension that comes into the picture is how these responses can be slotted as political, and yet they're so personal, right? And I think you said, it was right when you said personal is political is only one kind of sloganal truth, but it's true because you see them also as confessions. And I think that is what is beautiful. The confessional, deep confession, which is also a redeeming, in a way, redeeming us of a lot of burden that we carry of experience, of life. And yet, I mean, it's a liberating effect. It's a liberating effect. I'd just like to read one small thing as a response, because when you were talking about trees, and then you went beyond it and you said, because chinar turns up there. So I'm not going to read the poem that I wrote on my chinar tree, but here you are. I mean, I'm going to talk about shadows, which seem to follow us. And I'll just read, these are very small, I don't want to call them haikus, but I'll read two of them. When my shadow overtook me, when my shadow overtook me, I knew I had crossed the sun. I mean, it's over, and yet it's really starting, right, somewhere. I follow my shadow like it follows me. The intruder will be blackened. So, I really honestly feel that I could see some people amongst you silently clapping, right? Not in my case. Yeah, not in my case. When you were reading, I could see that there were, people wanting to respond. Why can't we liberate ourselves by giving the response? Like the Urdu walas do, Anis bhai, don't they? So bilkul wah karte hain. Many times it's without meaning. You know, when the moment you speak Urdu, there is wah, you know. But surely when you are touched with something, you're moved, or all those words that we were using, I think there has to be some response. And let's break that British culture, tight-lipped, quiet, and okay, something's happening in the soul, but nothing outside of that. All right, Medha, shall we?
Thank you to the Academy for having me. I am really grateful for this opportunity to be present among you all, so many poets, and to be part of this wonderful panel. Right, okay. I could speak louder. Is this better? Okay. Hello? Okay. Right. So long as we're speaking about the soul and dichotomies, I don't know how productive it is to be so preoccupied with defining it. I think it's more important to find a way to simply experience it. When I left India a couple of years ago to move to the UK, I felt over time a lot of my attachments to my things and to very casual friendships disintegrating. And I think at that point I began to feel a very deep sense of contentment. And in that contentment, there was something of the spiritual that I recognized. How we're experiencing the soul is not through this kind of, not through this idea of duality. We're not a soul inside a body. If you're going to say that, we might as well want to accept the idea of a body within a soul. Taking off from that, I would like to read two poems. One is by Linda Gregg, and it embodies this idea of complete contentment to me. And the other is by one of my professors and mentors, a wonderful poet who lives in Edinburgh, of Canadian origin called Patrick James Errington. The letter. I am not feeling strong yet, but I am taking good care of myself. The weather is perfect. I read and walk all day and then walk to the sea. I expect to swim soon. For now, I am content. I am not sure what I hope for. I feel I am doing my best. It reminds me of when I was 16, dreaming of Lorca, the gentle trees outside and the creek. Perhaps poetry replaces something in me that others receive more naturally. Perhaps my happiness proves a weakness in my life. Even my failures in poetry please me. Time is very different here. It is very good. Good to be away from public ambition. I sweep and wash, cook and shop. Sometimes I go into town in the evening and have pastry with custard. Sometimes I sit at a table by the harbor and I drink half a beer. Right. The other poem is called Self-Portrait with You and Elk. I find the title really interesting because we're experiencing ourselves with animals in this world, and yet we have a kind of divorced idea of what existence and being is in its essential sense. And as Mary Oliver's poem was mentioned earlier on stage, when we speak about our place in the family of things, I think this poem perfectly embodies it. Self-Portrait with You and Elk by Patrick James Errington. You are not here yet, or you were and have just slipped out to get the post or open the curtains in the other room, so the dying philodendrons can get a little light. Either way, you could be here any minute, have been. For the time being, the birch bleeds across the lintel, wind-wetted, drying slow. Elk come and go, pressing noses to the glass, a rasp and haze of breath, reminding me how much lies between, that atoms rattle, almost empty, that nothing quite touches. Yet there are mornings I wake to the sound of antler being shorn against the baseboards, the shriek of vast bodies heaving against each other across the frost at sunrise. What wonder we have art and syllables. I say touches, and that morning comes painted about me. Brilliant wash of tone, stone fact, a touch of artifice, but nothing dries right. Smudging here and there. I can only guess this is where you should go, asleep, light frailing your skin, if only for the space where the sheets fade and fray off. That might be my hand on your waist from that weft in the canvas, and maybe not. Still, judging by the blue flaying the pillow, your hair would be thrown antler wide, given just a little more color. Another word, linen maybe, fetlock or flax, rust, sorrel, rain. Even words have stopped working. You are every one of them, all you could be, should be, but what you are. And somewhere in the dark, elk are shaking hoarfrost from their hides, their hoofs tearing the frozen grass for nothing. What small wonder I have hands, this means of leaving things unfinished. I'll proceed to read some of my poems now. They're from my forthcoming collection, After Body. The first poem's called After. I held you under open heat by a river that warmed and curved in the distance. It sloshed beneath trains in that strange society. Our dawns tapered, turning gelatinous within the deep grammar of love. I peppered these quiet words for you across the marmalade dusk. And now you stand in a field within my solitude. There is a god moving her dark hand in water over the straits where whales go to carve. In shallows they find muster for the new babe. The grass glitters. Daisies quiver in their windy groove as you begin to remember our time. I could not gather you up, knowing your nose, your tongue might find another. Snug in the air, coiling our concrete past. It now cracks around the waists of women you think you finally learned to love. Think of me as a hand in the pines from a purer time, as error and ghost still coring your chest, stubborn, unmoving. This next poem is about wanting to run away from home and from yourself. Look at the bronze bird between the white birches, moon-washed and soft now the oak above the rocks, and the woman sitting inside the window with her cat. Sometimes this makes up for what she, drunk on an old pain, mistakes for the present. The sounds of the day roll up like canvas as points of starlight peek through the grape-black sky. There emerges the voice again, leaves whirling that always sing a tune she knows. How foolish was Eve, never saw that Adam was her father. Adam did not know how to touch a woman. She's thinking of herself as a sad clown whose games are flashing through the bare trees. She's inside the ocean, wending her way through water. She is bone-tired, kissed dry. She is alluvium and foam. She's taking tonight's train, running away from home. Falling asleep in a shivering seat, she wakes to morning, baking her face under Baltic sun. Senescent, how she floats now, chewing on the ashes of God. I'll read these last two. One is about a garden, one's about a park. And I think these things constitute to our great experience of what we know as the soul, in the smallness of nature and in the bigness of nature. But they're all very manicured experiences as well, so we have to surrender to some admission of fault on our part too. Rewilding. Ecstasy, I was told, is to lie outside oneself. The way we think of a garden, the only way the earth shakes awake from its taupe dream and enters world into verdure, or the way the invisible becomes apparent in visible things, wind undulating in wheat, light flickering across stones under racing water. Look at the life with bones and words, small yet sad, with all its fine writing by the refined, consummate, and surely dead. All I want in the anxiety and aimlessness of world and ecstasy is the courage of gardens that endure the quivers of time, the kind to hold me through the burning of a child in snow, where there is none to attend but a blanket and me. This poem's called, it's a two-part poem. I live in Edinburgh, and there's this huge, it's like Lothian Gardens, but this huge part of central Edinburgh called the Meadows. It's mostly green. Because of that spot in the city is mostly green. The slow tension of your step I know so well. Now its absence in air. Where I drop my eyes as they shine under sun. In the red view behind closed eyelids, I fall inside a river of lavender carrying on into our days as we lie in the meadows. God's feints bruise the rising moon. They come for me as you leave, my cheeks saline now that it's clear the sun only eats so much darkness. Darkness sick of itself, a mendicant praying for light. I alone enter the black cave of your mouth. I alone cuddle its tongue with mine. The clouds now, sorry, go on. The clouds now burn off under white light, bracken and bramble browning in white weather. Here is yet another odd animal, woman appearing volatile, woman appeasing volatile man, and you see, foreign too, trying to seem relaxed so she can justify wearing her cotton dungarees in this joke of a summer. Watch her try to contain fidget, shiver, and retort. Barbecue smoke rising from grass against skin, muscle, and a child sleeps on his father's stomach, who sleep inside the stomach of a hammock, lulled by the warmth of body and day. This will be my last poem. Speaking of the soul, this is about, well, the other poem was about wanting to run away from home and yourself. This is about being given the chance at another life. And I wrote this poem after I saw this really stupid thing written on a wall, like you're given 2 lives, and the second is when you realize you just have 1 life. It's called Another Life. I'm writing love on a serviette as mourners gather on a mound for the disgraced dead. Still in grave clothes underfoot, suddenly slow pianos sing in air, the shifting earth moving its cadavers to an ache in the ocean. Here they are, criminals reborn as willows, contorted into pains they do not recognize. Bad men slowly become trees. The earth forgives them, as do I. They begin to give. The wicked also dream of love. They know darkness overhead means night before and night behind. Yet drops of light have shot through this earth's evening. Overhead, ginkgo trees have flared against sun. Evening over tarmac, evening beneath lorries, where dogs huddle for warmth, and for miles on end, the quiet noise of town. And at the end of the last mile, me, pouring the syrup on a napkin. Things I can't say yet. Oh, pianos, oh, love, how we begin to open under black water. Thank you.
Thank you, Meda. Lovely poems. And I was just thinking, you know, I mean, we are all, of course, also trying not to manipulate, but there is also manipulation of language that comes in when you're writing poetry. I only hope it doesn't become devious at times, because you also try to create delusions for yourself, you know, of whatever your nature of your experience is. But I was also thinking of a very powerful tradition that we have in this part of the world, and that is our Sufi Bhakti tradition. And the directness of the expression of poetry there, it's all soul perhaps and very little body, or maybe body and soul totally integrating with each other. And Meda, thank you for bringing me to that point, because when you were talking about runaway experience, you know, or the desire to, or whatever, and also you were using in different poems, I think it's come twice. Mendicant? Once, is it? Okay, all right, once, but it stayed as twice, thrice. It was echoing in my mind, right? So anyway, nothing to do with that, but I was basically thinking of how there has been a kind of a very, very strong tradition of direct expression, right? And that's why I use the word manipulation, you know, for many of us with writing poetry, and sometimes manipulate language in a particular way to reach it. I mean, it can be manipulation, it can be crafting or whatever. But I want to emphasize on the idea of directness of expression, which is not all that direct perhaps, but it has something to do with the structure of a being. And so one thinks of people like, or other saints like, or other sants like Kabir, you know, or Vachanas, Mahadevi Akka, or whatever. They just come hitting at you, you know. Lali mere lal ki ijjat dekhu to lal, lali dekhan main gayi, main bhi ho gayi lal. Seems very simple. But if you start thinking about it, I mean, whether it's music or philosophy of life or what, everything comes into it, and you have to उसमें रचना बसना पड़ता है, you know, and you grow into it day by day, and as you grow older, more and more into it, and then you think of, गालिब का ही है ना, दरिया जो डूब के जाना पड़ता है, आग का दरिया है और डूब कर जाना पड़ता है. तो I mean, what the hell? I mean, what are we doing, right? डूबो, मरो या जियो उसके बाद में. Leave it to the world. But that's what poetry does for you. You know, the courage to either live or die. So either live or die. We want to do both, and that's where manipulation happens. That's what compromise is all about. And that's what, so I don't know where I'm going in saying all this, but this was very spontaneous in the context of how, you know, this tradition that we have. Kabir is contemporary even today. We cannot say it's a thing of a poet of the past, right? Even today we feel the same. Even today we want to explore truths of various kinds. उसके अलग-अलग रंग, उसके भाव, उसको समझना, उसमें या समझना नहीं, just feel that. So that tradition, I think, is far more live to us as a running tradition than in the West, perhaps.
I'd like to add something to that. I don't think it's fair to draw a difference between a creative, which is to say new use of language, and calling it manipulation. Creative expression, renewal of expression, this is very important for the robustness of poetry in any language. It is true, people work around experimental poetry and stuff. And I do think that when you're playing with structure, it's just as important as trying to generate full objects of meaning. I do also accede to your point about this difference between direct expression and indirect expression in the West. Because, I mean, their society is completely fragmented. They have a fractious experience of being, so they are unable to create whole objects of meaning, as we have been able to in our traditions, especially as you mentioned, Kabir, even Ghalib or Fez, right? We have wholesome experiences of partition, of multiple languages playing against each other. This is not really known to them. But I do think that we also have something to take from that. It is to understand and to cultivate a very rich inner interiority. It is not just in song and music. It has to be rife with meaning, with experience, with richness of emotion. And if that is expressed creatively, I don't think that's necessarily manipulation of language as much as it is a new way to use it. Because a lot of the time it's not intended. People have a voice.
Sure. I mean, there's a range, isn't it, from one point to the other. And where is it that you come, where does your expression come in? To what extent is one kind of negotiating with language? And I'm going deeper into it in the context of even transparency of what goes on. Is one trying to translate an abstraction into concrete language, and is there a certain kind of translation that is happening of experience into expression of soul, right, as we have that phrase being used here. Rumi, would you have something to say about it?
Am I audible? Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot. Well, it's a great honor to be here. Sir, take it? It's a great honor to be here. I see my former teachers here, Professor Rahman, Anisur Rahman Sabi guided me in MPhil like 27 years ago. I see some other people I learned from teachers and some would-be teachers also. So it's a great honor being here. I did not think that I would read my poems, but maybe I'll search it on mobile and do it. And I wanted to keep this very specific. If you look at the concept of soul as a very specific concept, and so you have a poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It's called The Soul's Expression, and it actually talks about the soul in that sense. If you also look at this famous Milton sonnet, which is On His Blindness, it, in that sense, does not talk exactly about the soul, but it does talk about inner conflict So innermost conflict of a person, which is in that sense, the soul is torn apart perhaps. And for Milton it was, because he was a very devout person. And then, those, that famous line, those also serve God who only stand and wait. So it's like there's nothing you can do, just wait, and you still serve God in that sense. You have these, so maybe we can look at the expression of innermost conflicts of the poetic self, which could be exemplified through literary as well as linguistic expression. Also, yeah, louder. Okay. Okay. Sure. I think this would be. Is this better? Okay. Shout a bit. Fine. All right. In fact, if you also look at the 20th century, and if you look at this iconic poem, The Wasteland, for instance, it's not exactly an expression of the individual self, but it is an expression of the self of the civilization. So in that sense, it does talk about, it does express these issues. So maybe, I saw a couple of points coming up in the session earlier. So I had points about death, points about silence, and there's a poem by Ramanujan. It's actually called On the Death of a Poem. It's a very short poem, and it's called, so it's titled On the Death of a Poem. It starts like this. It's a very short poem. Images consult one another. Images consult one another, a conscience-stricken jury, and come slowly to a sentence. With a full stop, the poem ends on a full stop. So it's a complete full stop. It's a sentence poem. It's one poem. It's a sentence, and it's a 3-stanza poem. It's a very short 3-stanza poem. So if you realize at the end of it all, what exists is probably just expression, maybe, and not much else. Maybe, conflicts of the self. If you look at this short poem by Ramanujan again, called Still Life, it says, when she left me after lunch, I read for a while, but I suddenly wanted to look again, and I saw the half-eaten sandwich, bread, lettuce, and salami, all carrying the shape of her bite. Stops there. So identity, in fact, there's a poem called Self-Portrait. I don't know where I put self-portrait, but that's okay. Okay. So, Ramanujan has these, issues. In fact, just a second. I'll take a bit. Economies and the golden bough, but my watchers are silent, as if they knew my truth is in fragments. If they could, I guess they would say only the first is clear, the second is dim, the third is ignorant. And it takes a lot of character not to call it mystery, to endure the fog and search the mango grove, unfolding leaf and twig for the zebra-striped caterpillar in the middle of it, waiting for the change of season. So these are, in fact, there is another Ramanujan poem called Chicago Zen. Maybe I'll refer to it later on. Or if you look at this poem by Aga Shahid Ali, a poet I keep on going back to all my life. And there's a poem called, it's not political or in that sense, social but not political, not sensitive. Okay, it's called Chandni Chowk, Delhi. Swallow this summer street, then wait for the monsoon. Swallow this summer street, then wait for the monsoon. Needles of rain melt on the tongue. Will you go farther? A memory of drought holds you. You remember the taste of hungry words, and you chew syllables of salt. And the last couplet, that's how the poem ends. You remember the taste of hungry words, and you chew syllables of salt. Can you rinse away this city? Can you rinse away this city that lasts like blood on the bitten tongue? And the poem ends. So that's Chandni Chowk, Delhi. So it's about Delhi history, bloody history, deaths, but it's not political in that sense, So maybe, it can still be political, but maybe we don't really have to make it political, and make it, adversarial, and, maybe that's also okay to make it adversarial for some people, So, and there's this poem called Stationery, which is again one of my very favorite poems, and Amitabh Ghosh, Vikram Chandra, we keep on, writing on Twitter, and, we keep on appreciating this poem. You've seen it on the London Underground, and I think the New York subway probably as well. It's a love poem, but it's an English poem. It's not an Oriental poem, it's an English poem. Stationery. The moon did not become the sun. It just fell on the desert in great sheets, reams of silver handmade by you. It just fell on the desert in great sheets, reams of silver handmade by you. The night is your cottage industry now. The day is your brisk emporium. The world is full of paper. Write to me. So in that sense, this is a love poem, but it's a poem where you're in tune with the beloved. So maybe that's also a kind of soul expression in some sense. And we had this references about emotions and about direct language. So maybe I could read it from my mobile phone. I never thought I was going to read my poems or was expected to. So a bit of it. Bits of it. It's actually called Vasudev Kutumbakam. So it just got published in a Hindi. I didn't expect that, but it got published in a Hindi translation recently. So it's basically about, it starts like this. It's called Vasudev Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, many languages. Looking for my half-bit tongue, I find Parsi, Gujarati, Hindi, and English in no particular order. These are the tongues I know. These are the languages I speak. I read, write. Each language I speak, I think in it all the same. I don't translate in my head to speak another language. My mother's tongue is Parsi Gujarati, an upper branch, a corrupted Gujarati. Most Gujaratis wouldn't recognize it, but it's okay with me. I don't mind. Even the People's Linguistic Survey of India, revered, respected in its multi-volumes, which charts out various dialects, languages of India, doesn't find space for Parsi Gujarati in its hallowed portals. Father is a Muslim Shia, bracket Sayyid, if it means anything. My father's tongue is Urdu, but he never taught me Urdu. I never went to Urdu school. I didn't have Urdu as a subject at mother tongue, and I'm proud of it. And it's a long poem, so I'll not read all of it. And just stop at this little thing. Last two stanzas? 1 minute. Okay. Okay. My half-bit tongue in my mouth doesn't hurt or pain me. My Parsi Gujarati variant, my mother's tongue, no knowledge of my father's tongue, jeers and sneers by some at the workplace at my name, bracket, a professor of history, long retired, would joke at my first name. He would say in public for years, your name is incorrect. They don't matter to me. Last stanza. I was named after Rumi, that great Sufi the world loves, under whose name there are fake quotes on the internet, but true Sufis don't mind. True Sufis don't mind anything. Rumi became the great Rumi after he shared his arrogance, and real Sufis always exude warmth and love for all. Let the world give pain, they would turn it out as love, and no one goes away hungry from a Sufi's house. Even if an enemy comes to seek help or advice, true Sufis give it. Add scorn, hatred, isolation, or praise to a Sufi. Throw anything at him, always take back warmth and love. That is why Vasudev Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, many languages. The only language that matters is the language of love, and that language is our real mother tongue. Thank you.
This is a beautiful, existentially powerful in the context of how there can be so much of plurality of languages, and yet communication is not easy unless you only talk of love, or rather feel love. So love binds it all, which is beyond languages that you're talking about. Thank you very much, Rumi. And Rumi is, in fact, your coming here to the stage was immediately after talking about Kabir and directness of expression, and you demonstrated that. Thank you so much. I think we have some, we're very happy to have you, Sachi, here as a senior poet. Very happy to see you sitting quietly, but you should speak also a little bit if you would like to react or respond, or say something about your soul, maybe, you know, or yeah. And we have so just short comments, please, just maybe from you. And we have GJV Prasad here, we have Jatin Naik here, we have Abhay here, so Sumanyu. So I'm not saying all of you speak, but if you are compelled to say something, you are most welcome. And others also. We have just about 3-4 minutes to go, right? 3-4 minutes, granted? Yeah. Sachi, would you please say something? Your response to the session?
So mic is there, yeah. And if someone was to ask something, so they can ask questions as well.
Well, I've been listening to, of course, all of you, and I felt that because the topic I thought was a little abstract, the expression of the soul. Everybody, of course, keeps saying poetry is the expression of the soul. But what matters ultimately is the way you express what you consider is your soul. And hence, I think language becomes extremely important in the context of expression. And that's where the soul in some way connects with the world. And it is perhaps only through words can we try to express ourselves, which we never do completely. But every poem is a kind of attempt to articulate what you consider to be your soul, what you consider to be the very spirit that seems to inhabit you, or the spirit in which you inhabit. And we are always trying, all the poets are in fact trying to make connections. Of course, Rumi was also speaking of connections when he quoted A.K. Ramanujan's poem. So we are trying to make connections between the soul and the body, the connections between the soul and language, the connection between the soul and what we think is contemporary. And you said it right, which I have been repeating many times, that the poets we love are all contemporary poets, because they speak to us in their own tongues. Shakespeare speaks to me, Kabir speaks to me, so does Andal, so does Akka Mahadevi. Because especially in a time like this, a time of strife and a time of hatred, they seem to say something extremely meaningful, extremely contemporary. They tell you, they speak to you about love, they speak to you about relationships, they speak to you about the need to live together in a world which is getting extremely poisoned, day by day. And I think that's where poetry comes in, where you connect, where you try to create a world of love which is so different from the kind of world that people seem to be anxious to create. That to me, at this particular moment, that's all that matters. How to relive love, or how to create a universe of love in a world where there is yes, so much of hatred, so much of attempt to create hatred between communities, between ideologies, between various approaches and attitude to life. So I think we need to speak more and more about love, and we need to perhaps reinvent our language. Because when the language is filled with, the marrow of the language is filled with poison, it is difficult to write. And that's what the poets in Nazi Germany said. And the poets in India, I believe, are also now trying to do the same, to create a new language, so that, because your language is so much filled with poison, and we want to reinvent the language where we can speak about love or honestly.
Because my first poem was called Soul Song, so I just want to read it. I was always here as blowing wind or falling leaves, as shining sun or flowing streams, as chirping birds or blooming buds, as the blue sky or the empty space. I was never born. I didn't die.
मैंने कहा कि सच्चिदानंद जी ने जो बात कह दी है उसके बाद कुछ कहने की गुंजाइश बचती नहीं है। उन्हें बहुत सारी बातें समेट ली हैं और आप लोगों ने सबने कहा।
So thank you so much, ma'am, and it was a nice session. Thank you so much, audience, for your patient listening and cooperation. So here we break for lunch, and the session will restart from 2:30.